It's been 40 years and the forest still knows my name. They told us the forest swallows people whole. We thought that was just a saying, a warning for the tourists, a romantic tragedy of the wilderness. But the truth is much darker than a simple drowning in the dense green. The truth is that sometimes something in those deep woods allows you to leave. It chooses to let you go, and that choice leaves a mark far worse than any trauma the forest itself could inflict. For 3 days we were lost. For 3 days we searched for a missing man who had simply vanished. And for those same 72 hours, something vast, ancient, and intelligent followed every single move we made. It watched us fail. It watched us break down, lose our direction, and accept our defeat. We weren't searching for it, but it found us. And when we were completely broken, lost, and giving up, it decided to show us the way home. I wish to God I had stayed lost, because carrying that memory, that secret, has been a heavier burden than any mountain range. I'm telling you this now because the memory is finally dissolving the barrier I built around it, and I need it to be gone before I am. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. My life was structured by the rhythm of the woods, the morning check-ins, the smell of burnt-out fires, the relentless mapping of the old-growth zones. It was a life of solitude, chosen after my marriage collapsed 5 years prior. My ex-wife had claimed I loved the trees more than her, and she wasn't wrong. The forest, at least, was predictable. It followed rules of physics and biology, or so I believed. I wasn't a romantic. I was a practical man, built for long hours and high-stakes trauma. My reputation, among the few who knew me, was built on survival. I had walked out of Category 5 fires that consumed everything, and I had been the lead recovery specialist on dozens of missions, hikers, hunters, and sometimes those who had simply stepped off the trail and ceased to exist. But there was a dark shadow in my professional history, a scar I carried deep in the gut. A decade earlier, I had led a search for a young girl near the North Fork. We found her jacket, but never her. That failure, the guilt of closing that file without an answer, was the engine that drove me now. Every call for a missing person was a chance to finally settle that debt, to prove I could control the unpredictable heart of the wilderness. I slept mostly in my battered Ford pickup or in the small, damp ranger station near the boundary line. My routine was a shield against the internal chaos. Coffee black, sunrise navigation checks, late dinners of canned beans and cold meat. The loneliness wasn't an inconvenience. It was the price of admission for a life lived on the edge of the map. I preferred the silence of the woods to the demanding noise of civilization. This particular call came late on a Tuesday in late September. The air was already biting, carrying the promise of the heavy, soul-crushing winter snows that would seal off the high peaks until spring. It wasn't a lost hiker, which usually meant reckless tourists chasing waterfalls. This was different. This was Dr. Alistair Finch, a highly respected geologist from the University of Seattle, specializing in deep tectonic mapping and mineral deposits. Finch knew the risks. He went in prepared, always filing a detailed itinerary, always carrying redundant communication gear. He had been mapping near the notorious Copper Creek area, a region known for volatile weather, steep, crumbling shale ridges, and abandoned, undocumented mine shafts dating back to the 1920s gold rush. It was unforgiving terrain even for the most seasoned professional. Finch had missed his mandated check-in. The university raised the alarm, then the local sheriff's department got involved, and by 0600 Wednesday morning, I was leading the preliminary search team. My team was sparse, by necessity. There was Deputy Miller and Deputy Sanchez, 2 young men fresh out of the academy, eager, strong, but possessing the kind of superficial fearlessness that comes from inexperience. They were proficient with GPS and protocol, but the forest was an abstract concept to them, not a living entity. Then there was me, and there was the weight of that old trauma, pushing me forward, demanding success. We found Finch's rig exactly where he'd logged it, parked perfectly at the last drivable access point before the trail dissolved into dense brush and rock. The location was remote, nestled in a small, almost invisible clearing between 2 massive stands of Douglas fir. Trees so old, they blocked out the midday sun entirely. The first knot of dread twisted in my stomach as I approached the vehicle. It wasn't the truck being there that was disturbing. It was the complete lack of disorder. Finch was meticulous, but the scene was too quiet, too clean. The keys were still in the ignition. Deputy Miller instinctively opened the driver's door. On the dashboard, lying next to a field notebook filled with intricate geological sketches, was a half-eaten sandwich, turkey and provolone, judging by the smell, and a half-full thermos of coffee still faintly warm. It was an instant abandonment, not a gradual wandering away while foraging. Someone doesn't leave a warm meal and their keys unless they intended to be back in under 60 seconds, or unless they were pulled away without warning. And yet, there were no signs of a struggle. No scattered gear, no broken branches, no blood. "He just stepped out," Sanchez muttered, his youthful confidence already showing cracks. "Geologists don't step out without their notebooks in the field," I corrected him, pulling on my heavy leather gloves. He was working, and then he wasn't. The air felt unusually heavy, almost compressed. I looked up at the canopy. Even though the massive firs usually let through a dappled, shifting light here, it was static, almost purple dark. The forest itself seemed to be holding its breath. I felt the familiar cold prickle on the back of my neck, the old instinct screaming danger, the signal that always preceded a mountain lion kill or a sudden rock slide. This was different, though. This wasn't natural danger. I walked the immediate perimeter, focusing on the soft, pine needle-littered ground. Miller and Sanchez were sweeping wide arcs, checking for standard hiking boot prints or drag marks. I focused on the abnormal. There was nothing. The ground was clear. Finch, an average-sized man, had stepped out of his truck and walked into the undergrowth, leaving no discernible trace. It was as if the ground had sealed itself up behind him. But then, the first sensory clue hit me. It wasn't visual, and it wasn't tactile. It was a smell. It was fleeting, a quick inhale before the wind shifted, and then it was gone. But it was distinct enough to make my stomach clench and my knees feel momentarily weak. It was not the scent of decay, nor the rank, sour musk of a bear which I knew intimately. It was profoundly organic, yes, but layered. Imagine the smell of wet, unwashed fur, heavy and thick, mixed with something earthy like rotten fruit left baking in the heat, but overlaid with a strangely clean, almost metallic note, like ozone or wet iron. It was sharp, wild, and utterly ancient. It spoke of immense, unbridled power. I straightened up, breathing deeply, trying to catch the trace again. Nothing but damp cedar and pine pitch. "Did either of you smell that?" I called out, keeping my voice low. Miller, focused on a nearby mossy rock, shook his head. "Smell what, Elias?" "Just the usual P&W dampness." I didn't press it. I didn't want to sound unhinged within the first hour, but the hair on my arms was standing up, and the professional mask I wore was beginning to crack. That smell wasn't supposed to be here. It felt misplaced, like hearing the roar of the ocean 100 miles inland. We established our base camp next to Finch's truck. The plan was simple. 3 days of intensive search and rescue grids, starting from the last confirmed GPS ping Finch had sent the night before his check-in. We had enough supplies and batteries for the full 72 hours. Failure wasn't an option, not this time. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, menacing shadows across the clearings, the temperature plummeted. We built a small, controlled fire, more for morale than for warmth, although the deputies looked cold already. We spread out our maps, reviewing the difficult terrain that lay ahead, a series of interlocking ravines and ridges that funneled into the old, heavily wooded Copper Creek zone. That first night was when the pressure started. We were isolated. The radio crackled with static. We were too deep within the ravines to get a solid signal back to the main station. We were truly alone, surrounded by the towering, indifferent sentinels of the forest. I was on the first watch, sitting by the dying fire, cleaning my rifle. The deputies were zipped into their sleeping bags, snoring lightly. The forest noises were the usual symphony of the night: the hoot of an owl, the snap of a distant branch settling, the gurgle of the nearby creek. But underneath those familiar sounds, something else was present. It was less a sound and more a vibration, a profound awareness that the darkness surrounding our small circle of firelight was not empty. I felt heavy eyes on me, not the curious gaze of a deer, nor the predatory focus of a large cat. This was an intellectual appraisal. I kept my breathing slow, my hands steady on the rifle stock. I scanned the darkness, moving my head slowly, looking for the telltale gleam of reflection, a trick I had perfected over 2 decades. But there was nothing. The darkness was absolute, impenetrable. Yet, I knew it was there. And then I heard the breathing. It was so soft, so perfectly modulated into the background hum of the woods that, if I hadn't been an expert listener, I would have dismissed it as the wind passing through the upper canopy. But the wind wasn't blowing. The air was still and cold. It was a deep, resonant intake of breath, heavy with effort, yet perfectly controlled. It was close enough that I could almost feel the slight vibration in the ground beneath my boots. It wasn't the shallow, fast gasp of a panicked animal. It was the slow, steady respiration of something immense, something resting and waiting, observing our every failure. I froze, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I turned my gaze slowly, millimeter by millimeter, toward the dense wall of ferns 50 feet away. That was the source. I sat there for 20 minutes, rigid, cold sweat running down my back, locked in a silent, invisible confrontation. The breathing never shifted pace. It was measured, patient. It felt less like a threat and more like a profound presence, an ancient watchman observing 2,000 years of history condensed into 3 pathetic, shivering human bodies. This wasn't a bear protecting a den. This wasn't a mountain lion stalking prey. This felt intelligent, calculating. I raised the rifle slightly. Resting the buttstock against my shoulder, I sighted down the barrel into the darkness where I knew those eyes were fixed on me. I held my breath, waiting for the pause, the shift, the sound that would justify pulling the trigger. It never came. The breathing continued its slow, silent cadence until, just as abruptly as the smell had vanished hours before, the sound faded into the white noise of the forest night. It had moved, but without a single breaking twig or rustle of leaves. It had simply dissolved back into the density of the woods, confirming one terrifying truth. We were not alone. And whatever was out there was monitoring us, letting us know it was present, but choosing, for reasons I couldn't fathom, not to engage. The search for Dr. Finch had just begun, but I knew in my gut, sitting there in the cold silence, that we were no longer the hunters. We were being watched, and we were entering a territory ruled by an intelligence that predated all our maps. Day 1 was over. The game had started, and we hadn't even found a single footprint. The second morning hit us like a physical blow. Not just the cold, it was the pervasive, bone-deep dampness of the Olympic temperate rainforest, the kind that leach the heat straight out of your core and cling to your gear like a shroud. We were deep inside the search grid now, 3 days into the official operation for Mr. Silas, the elderly historian who'd vanished near the old timber lines. We were 5 men, seasoned, hardened by years of search and rescue, but even veterans get ground down by the slow, suffocating crawl of a fruitless search. Every 10 yards was a calculation, a glance at the compass, a check of the topography map which, in this section of the woods, seemed to have been drawn by a drunken cartographer using spilled coffee. Every ridge looked the same. Every creek crossing was a slippery, treacherous act of faith. I remember my boots sinking into the black, sucking muck by the riverbank on that second day. The smell was pure rot, decaying ferns, ancient moss, and the metallic tang of cold river water. We were following a hunch, a narrow animal trail Silas might have taken seeking an old growth stand he'd mentioned to his family. We moved slow, synchronized by years of shared fear and exhaustion. But the silence, that was the first thing that began to corrode our professionalism. Normal woods noise is a symphony of distraction. You hear the scurry of mice, the territorial screech of jays, the drumming of woodpeckers, the constant background hum of insects. This area had been wiped clean. It wasn't merely quiet. It was dead. The sound just dropped out of the air 10 feet above the forest floor. Our own heavy breathing, the faint static of the radios strapped to our chests, the deliberate crunch of our boots, these sounds seemed offensively loud, echoing unnaturally against the velvet suffocating backdrop of the woods. It felt as if the air itself was dense, absorbing sound waves, pressing down on our skulls. Mike, our lead tracker, stopped dead in his tracks. Mike was a man whose nerves were steel cables, a former Marine who handled trauma like geometry. He raised a hand, palm flat toward us. We froze instantly. "What is it?" I whispered into the radio, the static sounding like shattered glass in my ear. "Listen," Mike hissed back, his voice too tight. We listened. We heard nothing, but the feeling was profound, visceral. It was the absolute certainty that we were being watched, not by a curious deer or a hungry bear, but with cold, calculating scrutiny. It was a weight on the back of my neck, the primitive spike of adrenaline that bypasses the rational brain entirely, screaming, "Threat." I tried to rationalize it. We were tired. We were stressed. The missing person was an old friend of mine, compounding the pressure. Fatigue plays tricks on the senses, turning tree stumps into lurking shadows. But 4 other men, all seasoned, were feeling the exact same thing. Their faces, pale beneath the grime and beard stubble, reflected the shared, unnamed anxiety. Then came the smell. It started faintly, a transient whiff carried on a slight updraft. Then it settled, heavy, cloying, utterly repulsive. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered in the woods, and I'd spent 30 years tracking everything from decomposing elk carcasses to meth labs. It wasn't merely the sulfurous stink of decay, nor the sharp ammonia tang of bear urine. This was organic, ancient, and deeply musky. Imagine the smell of wet, unwashed winter fur, but not a bear's. Something ranker. Combine that with the pungent, oily odor of ozone immediately following a lightning strike, and then add a strange, sweet undertone, like rotten fruit, mashed into damp earth. It was suffocatingly powerful. It coated the inside of my mouth, tasting metallic and foul. We all exchanged glances. Jim, usually the joker of the group, looked genuinely ill. He mouthed the word, "Bear." We shook our heads. Bears smell strong, yes, but predictably, this was alien, too complex, too deeply seated in the ground. It was the scent of something that lived outside the cycle of normal forest life, something that carried its environment, the deep earth, the rotting wood, the cold water in its very hide. The scent faded as quickly as it arrived, pulled away by a shift in the air pressure, leaving behind only the cold, hard memory of its wrongness. It left us tense, jumpy. Our search pattern tightened, our movements less fluid, more hesitant. We kept our hands near the holsters, even though we knew rationally that whatever smelled like that was too big to be deterred by standard-issue sidearms. We pressed on for another hour, moving uphill through a grove of ancient cedars. It was here on the northern slope where the soil was softer, richer, and held impressions perfectly, that Mike stopped again. This time he didn't signal for silence. He knelt slowly, his gloved hand hovering over the damp earth. The first footprints. I walked up and looked over his shoulder. My breath hitched in my throat. I felt the familiar cold knot of dread tighten instantly, because this was evidence that bypassed all rationalization. The tracks weren't just big, they were monumental. A man's print is maybe 12 inches, deeply compressed if he's carrying 80 pounds of gear. A large grizzly print is massive, distinct with the heavy claws and splayed pads. These prints were 15, maybe 16 inches long, wide across the ball of the foot, tapering toward a distinct heel. But what truly stole the air from my lungs was the stride. The distance between the heel marks was impossible. We measured it quickly, nearly 6 feet of separation. A human running at full tilt might achieve that, but these prints were from a slow, deliberate walk, deep set into the heavy, wet soil. We estimated the weight immediately, based on the compression depth in that particular kind of loam. The individual who made those tracks must have weighed well over 800 pounds, maybe closer to 1,000. Mike ran a tape measure, his hand steady but his eyes wide and glazed over. "The arch. Look at the arch structure, Captain," he murmured, using my old rank instinctively. "It's not plantigrade like us, fully flat, but it's not fully digitigrade like a cat or a dog. It's a transition. And look here." He pointed to the forefoot. There were 5 distinct toe impressions, deeply defined, but without the splay or claw marks of a bear. They were broad, human in structure, but immensely powerful. The impression felt almost deliberate, like someone intentionally placing their full weight down with precision. We tracked them for 50 yards. They weren't random. They weren't meandering after prey. They were following the exact trajectory of the river Silas was thought to have followed. They were traveling with purpose, and that purpose seemed to be parallel to our own search vector. We tried to assign an explanation. High levels of adrenaline always trigger the bureaucratic need for control. "Big male grizzly, maybe," Jim offered weakly, though his eyes betrayed his disbelief. Grizzlies don't walk with a 6-foot stride, and they certainly don't have 5 distinct clawless toe pads perfectly imprinted in the mud. "Could be a hoax," another man, Lopez, suggested, clutching his rifle tighter. "Some idiot with carved boots trying to mess with SAR. I shot down the hoax idea immediately. Who makes 15-inch boots and walks 6 miles through this hell just to leave 3 perfect tracks for us to find? And why here? Silas vanished 5 days ago. This print is fresh. Yesterday, maybe, but not earlier. The tracks vanished abruptly where the ground transitioned to a rocky outcropping, a trick used by wildlife to break scent and sight lines. But the prints left behind were enough. They had introduced an insurmountable anomaly into our operation. We had been searching for a lost human being. Now, we were aware that something gigantic, unseen and highly intelligent was operating in the same area. We moved through the rest of that second day with a gnawing sense of violation. Every rustle of leaves was magnified. We scanned the tree line relentlessly, our eyes adjusting for the slightest movement, looking for a break in the heavy green camouflage. The forest had changed. It had stopped being a neutral environment and had become an observer, and we were the subjects. That evening, as the thick, paralyzing fog began to roll in, swallowing the sun hours before twilight, we found the next undeniable piece of evidence, pushing the creature beyond mere animal classification. We had set up a basic temporary shelter near a small spring, rationing our food and water. We were exhausted, our focus fractured by the earlier find. As Mike went to snap off a few dry branches for a meager fire, he came back holding a piece of wood that made my stomach clench. It was a piece of Douglas fir about 3 inches in diameter, but it wasn't broken by a falling tree or storm damage. It had been twisted and shattered laterally, perhaps 12 feet off the ground. The force required to do that to hardwood was staggering, far beyond the capability of any bear. A bear breaks branches lower down, digging for insects or honey. This break was high, clean, and violently rotational. It was the result of immense focused strength applied by a massive hand or arm. "Look at this," Mike said, his voice now flat, devoid of emotion. He was processing what he was seeing, locking it away behind the military discipline he had learned years ago. It wasn't snapped. It was wrung out like a wet towel. I took the wood from him. It felt oily, and the distinct, cloying smell of ozone and musk was strong on the splintered wood grain. It was intentional, a marker, a message. Why would something of that size break branches so high up? To clear a path? Or simply because it could? The revelation was chilling. Whatever was out there didn't have to navigate around the canopy like us. It simply moved through it, utilizing a vertical space we couldn't even reach. We found 3 more such breaks within a 100-yard radius of our camp. They were arranged almost geometrically, defining the perimeter of our makeshift shelter. It wasn't random feeding. It felt like territorial marking, or worse, a subtle containment. The third day began with a confirmation of our deepest fear. We packed up at first light, our movements mechanical, our silence heavy. We hadn't slept well. Every snapping twig sounded like a footfall. We were no longer searching for Silas. We were waiting for the forest to reveal its true inhabitant. The tracks reappeared precisely where we started. When we crossed the creek bed, the mud still soft from the night's drizzle, there they were, the enormous, deeply compressed prints. But this time they weren't parallel to our path. They were behind our footprints. The prints trailed our path for miles, following the exact route we had taken over the previous 48 hours. The individual was shadowing us, moving silently, unseen, walking where we had just walked. We had been watched from the moment we entered the deep wilderness. The weight in my chest became unbearable. It wasn't just fear now, it was a profound sense of humiliation and exposure. We were the professional search team, and we had been completely blind, moving through a landscape controlled by an intelligence far superior to our own tracking skills. How could something that large move so silently, so close to us, for so long? For 3 days we had eaten, slept, and searched under the continuous unseen gaze of this massive entity. Mike looked at the prints, then up at the dark, dripping canopy, his face a mask of exhausted terror. "It's not hunting, Silas," he whispered, the realization hitting us all simultaneously. "It's hunting us. Or maybe it's just leading us." The ambiguity was paralyzing. Was it tracking us for a kill, or was it merely observing the clumsy trespass of humans? The memory of Silas, the reason we were there, began to blur, replaced entirely by the immediate, overwhelming presence of the creature shadowing our steps. We had crossed a line. We were no longer rescuers. We were quarry, trapped in a silent, watchful wilderness, 3 days away from civilization, and the only other living thing nearby seemed to be an impossible giant that had just finished establishing the boundaries of its territory right around our camp. The Forest Service explanation, bears, hoaxes, stress, began to feel absurd, flimsy. We knew deep down that we were experiencing something that the outside world would immediately dismiss, something that sat outside the realm of accepted biology. We pushed on, heartbeats hammering against the humid silence, knowing every step we took was a step that had already been taken moments before by a colossal, intelligent shadow. We were walking a trail that had been meticulously scouted and cleared, and we were finally beginning to understand that we weren't just lost in the woods. We were allowed to be there. And that permission could be revoked at any moment. The transition from the second day to the third day wasn't marked by a sunrise, but by a thicker, colder blanket of air that settled deep in the valley floor. We were tired, the kind of exhaustion that isn't cured by sleep, but by the cessation of the relentless search. My shoulders ached, not just from the weight of the 90-pound pack, the radios, the medical gear, the extra rope, but from the invisible burden of the ticking clock. That missing man, Dr. Alistair, had been gone 72 hours. Survival odds were plummeting, and my team was starting to wear thin around the edges. We were 3 professionals, myself, the leader, the one supposed to hold the map, Ben, the medic, stoic until his eyes gave away the fear, and Callie, the navigation expert whose usually steady hands were starting to twitch. On day 3, the forest stopped merely being difficult. It became actively deceptive. Callie was the first to sound the alarm, though she did it quietly, almost a whisper meant only for me. We were halted near a small, perpetually damp stream, trying to filter brackish water through a carbon pump. She knelt over her GPS unit, her brow furrowed into deep lines, tapping the screen repeatedly, as if she expected the technology to suddenly confess its malfunction. "Ranger," she'd said, using the formal address that signaled genuine trouble. "My readings are drifting, not just mildly off. We logged our position precisely 12 hours ago, right before we set up the bivouac. We followed the drainage south exactly as planned for 3 kilometers. But the grid coordinates I'm getting now, they put us back near the saddle. Impossible." I dismissed it immediately. Stress, magnetic interference from the local geology, battery degradation. We were in a high mineral content area, it happened. But when I pulled out my own military-grade receiver and cross-referenced the satellite fix, my stomach dropped. Callie wasn't wrong. The map showed a jagged, inexplicable detour. We hadn't traveled 3 kilometers south. We had effectively circled, traveling 2.5 kilometers in a wide, sickening arc that led us almost exactly back to where we started. The compass then, I commanded, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Forget the satellites, we trust the needle. But the needle was useless, not spinning wildly, which would have indicated strong metal ore interference, but sluggishly, pointing consistently in a direction that felt fundamentally wrong, towards a massive, sheer cliff face we knew shouldn't be there, according to the topographic maps we'd memorized. The air, which had been merely cold, began to feel heavy, dense, insulating us from the rest of the world. It was the crushing silence again, amplified. It was in this suffocating quiet, as we wrestled with the undeniable fact of our own disorientation, that the first layered reveal of the entity's presence became not a suspicion, but a tangible, sickening certainty. The scent hit Ben first, and he gagged. Ben was an ex-smoke jumper. Nothing made him gag. He spat onto the mossy ground, wiping his mouth with the back of a shaking hand. "What is that?" he wheezed, eyes wide and scanning the dense undergrowth. "Rotten meat? Something died recently. Big." I recognized it instantly. It wasn't the clean metallic scent of a bear kill, nor the sickly sweetness of deer bloat. This was something ancient, feral and deeply musky, like stale urine mixed with damp, unwashed fur that had never known sunlight. But there was another layer to it, subtle and profoundly disturbing. The smell of ozone, that sharp, almost electrical tang that you sometimes get right before a massive thunderstorm or near a high-voltage power line. It was a smell of immense, suppressed energy. It wasn't just near us. It permeated the air, thickest when the wind dropped completely. It was as if the air itself had passed through the creature's dense coat, leaving an invisible, lingering signature. We were breathing the residue of whatever was out there. We forced ourselves forward, pushing through thickets of rhododendron and scrambling over slippery, algae-covered boulders. The paranoia was now a living thing among us, whispering arguments and doubt. Ben started counting our pace, his head down, while Callie refused to look up from the forest canopy, convinced a predatory bird was tracking our movements. I was the only one looking at the ground, and that's when I saw the second layer of evidence, the physical proof that shattered the narrative of magnetic anomaly or human error. We had just traversed a particularly difficult section of exposed mudflats bordering the creek, which meant our own boot prints were clearly impressed into the dark silt. As I stepped over a particularly large, slick root, I saw it. A disturbance. It wasn't a print, not clearly defined like a plaster cast, but a massive displacement of earth roughly 18 inches long, too wide for a human foot, and pressed so deep into the compacted soil that water was already pooling in the hollow. It was running parallel to our path about 10 feet off to the side, hidden slightly under a veil of dripping fern leaves. "Ben, look at this," I murmured, my voice automatically dropping to a hush I hadn't realized I was capable of. Ben approached cautiously, his medic bag hanging forgotten at his side. He knelt, tracing the outline with a gloved finger. "Bear?" he asked, but he knew the answer already. A bear tracks on its knuckles and pads. Its gait is shuffling. This was a clear heel-to-toe stride, bipedal, with an unnatural length between the impact zones, suggesting a walking stride that could easily cover 8 or 10 feet in a single step. "No bear walks like this, Ben," I corrected him. "And no bear wears boots. Look at the weight distribution. It's flat-footed, centered, heavy, and look how it matches our direction. It's keeping pace." The sheer arrogance of it. It wasn't trying to hide the tracks entirely. It was simply staying far enough off our immediate trail that we wouldn't stumble upon them accidentally, assuming we were preoccupied with simply staying upright. It knew our routines. It knew where we would be looking. As we continued moving, the evidence became more unnerving. The entity wasn't just walking alongside us. It was interacting with the environment in subtle, deliberate ways that screamed of impossible strength and observational intelligence. We passed a stand of young alders, their trunks no thicker than my forearm. 2 of them, positioned perfectly to frame our current path, had been snapped clean off, not jaggedly broken like high winds would do, but bent and fractured at a height of 8 feet. The wood fibers pulled apart as if by massive, careless hands. We were being monitored, tracked, but more chillingly, we were being guided. That third layer, the behavioral evidence, began to unfold not through physical sightings, but through the realization that our movements were being anticipated and reacted to almost instantaneously. We decided to cut diagonally across a deep ravine, believing that the sudden change in elevation and direction might force any stalker to either reveal themselves or fall behind. It was a brutal climb, slippery with decomposing leaf litter. We hauled ourselves up the final bank, collapsing onto the flat, mossy shelf at the top, our lungs burning raw with the thin, cold air. We rested for perhaps 5 minutes, drinking the filtered water that tasted vaguely of the musky air, our focus entirely inward, fighting the nausea of exertion. Then, from directly across the ravine, perhaps 60 yards away, where the fog was starting to thicken into an impenetrable wall of white moisture, we heard the sound. It was a cough, faint, quickly suppressed but undeniably human, or at least possessing the exact cadence and resonance of a human clearing their throat from fatigue. A soft, wet ahem. We froze, every muscle locked. That ravine was uncrossable without significant time and equipment. It would have taken us a minimum of 20 minutes to climb down and up the opposing bank. "Did you hear that?" Callie whispered, her voice tight with terror. Ben, who had been resting his forehead on his knees, lifted his head slowly. "Alistair? Is that you, Dr. Alistair?" he called out, his voice cracking on the missing man's name. Silence. The oppressive, wet, smothering silence returned, only thicker now, laced with the knowledge that whatever had made that sound had done so intentionally, letting us know that our grueling maneuver had failed. It hadn't just kept pace, it was already there. And this was the truly terrifying part. The cough hadn't sounded like a lost, desperate hiker. It sounded like Ben's cough. That slight rasp, the specific pitch of a man who'd spent too many seasons breathing wildfire smoke. The implication was staggering. The entity was either capable of near instantaneous, silent traversing of impossible terrain, or it had been watching us long enough to learn our individual vocal tics and was now using them as psychological leverage. It was intelligent. It was playful. It was toying with us, letting us know the game was fixed. We pressed on, the silence now a tangible weight on our shoulders. We kept looking back, but the foliage was too dense, the shadows too deep. We started arguing about whether we should abort the mission entirely. Ben was panicking, insisting we follow the compass needle back the way it pointed, regardless of the map. Callie was cold, analytical, suggesting we must be suffering from some form of carbon monoxide poisoning from the faulty cooking stove we used last night. But I knew neither was true. My gut, that old ranger instinct that had saved my life more times than I could count, was screaming. We were not lost due to poor navigation. We were lost because something was actively hurting us. I started to focus less on the map and more on the patterns of the disturbances. Where we would usually find heavy deadfall, obstructing our path and forcing a long detour, now there were convenient, small clearings, just wide enough for 3 men to pass through quickly. Where the creek had spread out into a confusing series of braided channels, there was often a single, slightly dislodged stone placed conveniently in the fastest path, creating a stepping stone that wasn't there when we had studied the map earlier that morning. It was like following an invisible, silent trailblazer. I paused, raising a hand to stop the team. We were standing under the skeletal canopy of ancient cedars, the light failing fast, painting everything in shades of sickly yellow-green. I pointed ahead, to a narrow, nearly vertical trail that led directly up a scree slope. "We go up there," I stated. Callie bristled. "That's inefficient, Ranger. The map shows the highest probability zone is downriver, where Alistair's notes suggested he was headed." "The map is wrong," I snapped, the built-up exhaustion and fear finally manifesting as sharp irritation. "It's been wrong since we started day 3. We are not following paper anymore. We are following the lack of resistance. I pointed to the base of the scree slope. There, perfectly positioned on a small mound of damp earth, was a single, fist-sized stone, clearly placed there, not naturally rolled. It was gray granite, a common rock, but it sat there like a marker. A silent instruction. "Whatever is out there," I explained, lowering my voice, realizing the profound terror in my own confession, "it wants us to go up that ridge. It's been leaving breadcrumbs since the sun came up. We follow the breadcrumbs, Callie, because I have a feeling that if we fight it, we stop getting guidance. And if we stop getting guidance, we will truly be lost, and we might stop breathing that musky air forever." Ben and Callie exchanged a long, panicked look. They didn't understand the depth of my realization yet, that we were under the protection, or at least the intense observation, of something that possessed superhuman capabilities and a terrifying level of patience. But they were too tired and too scared to argue further. They saw the fear in my eyes, the fear of a man who finally understood that they were not the hunters, but the prey being managed. We started the brutal ascent of the scree slope, our boots slipping and sliding on the loose shale. Every step was misery, and with every painful step I heard the subtle snap of a branch far, far above us, higher up the ridge, the sound of our grim shepherd effortlessly maintaining its position, ensuring its flock stayed on the intended path. We were moving closer to the heart of the mystery, whether we wanted to or not, driven forward by the terrifying, invisible intelligence that stalked us through the primeval woods. The forest was closing in, and we had unknowingly just accepted the creature's silent terms of engagement. The third day felt less like a continuation of the search and more like an endurance trial designed by something cold and impossibly old. The sun barely penetrated the canopy, casting everything in a sickly, green-yellow light that made the shadows seem viscous. We were deep now, further than the map suggested we should be, navigating terrain that simply wasn't marked, or perhaps terrain that had been subtly steered into. The initial fatigue had curdled into a permanent bone-deep ache, amplified by the terror that had become the ambient noise of our existence. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that impossible footprint, too wide, too heavy, too human, burned into my eyelids. But worse than the image was the smell. It was relentless, an olfactory anchor of dread. It wasn't just the odor of wet fur or decomposition. It was complex, a layered scent that spoke of centuries in the damp earth. Sulfur, ozone after a lightning strike, the cloying sweetness of rot, and underneath it all, a sharp, clean scent of pure, aggressive musk. It permeated our clothing, our gear, and eventually, our very breath. We tasted the Bigfoot in our stale rations. Jackson, usually the most stoic member of our four-man team, was unraveling visibly. He started whispering to himself not about the mission, but about the forest itself, calling it malevolent. He kept swiping at his neck, convinced that insects were crawling under his collar, though the air was too cold for bugs. I knew it wasn't bugs. It was the feeling of being surveyed, of having your every micro-movement cataloged and judged. We tried to maintain protocol, checking our compass bearings repeatedly, but the readings were starting to feel suspect. We'd follow a ravine east, certain that we would intercept the old logging road, only to find ourselves looping back to the same cluster of ancient moss-covered monoliths we'd passed 3 hours prior. It was subtle disorientation, nothing dramatic like a full magnetic anomaly, but enough to erode confidence. We were navigating through psychological warfare disguised as terrain. "We're going in circles, Captain," Miller finally stated, his voice thin and cracking. He hadn't shaved in days, and the dirt coating his face made his eyes look sunken and feverish. "The maps are useless. We're losing elevation we shouldn't be losing." I looked down at the mud where he pointed. There, unmistakable, were our own boot prints from the morning, but alongside them, almost superimposed, were the impressions we had been trying to deny for 48 hours. The wide, flat press of something impossibly heavy. The creature wasn't just following us, it was hurting us. It was in this moment, mid-morning of day 3, that the fear shifted from existential dread to a terrifying realization of intelligence. Whatever this thing was, it was not merely an aggressive ape or an undiscovered primate. It understood strategy. It knew the terrain better than we knew our own hands. It was using the forest as its canvas, and we were merely the paint strokes it was pushing around. I knelt down, ignoring the ache in my knees, studying the tracks meticulously this time, not just dismissing them as large bear sign. This track was distinct. 3 days ago, they had been cautious, skirting the edges of our periphery. Now they were confident, almost defiant. The stride length was phenomenal, nearly 7 feet between steps when it moved at pace. But the incredible detail was the pressure distribution. A massive weight was being placed with such deliberate softness that only the deepest parts of the heel and the ball of the foot left significant impressions in the wet soil. It was walking silently, because it chose to walk silently. "It's closer now," I muttered, my mouth dry. I didn't need Jackson's frantic head swiveling to confirm it. The oppressive silence that had plagued us for 2 days had become amplified. Normally, the forest, even deep in the wilderness, vibrates with sound. Birds, insects, the rush of air through the pines. Here, there was nothing. It was like being sealed inside a pressurized vacuum chamber. The only sounds were the rasp of our own breathing and the heavy, metallic clink of our gear. Then came the physical evidence of its manipulation. As we tried to strike off due west again, seeking a known ridgeline, we came across a stretch of massive Douglas firs. These trees were giants, centuries old, their lower branches 50 feet above the ground. And yet roughly 12 feet up, a line of fresh breakage scarred the trunks. Not splintering, but a clean snap, like a massive hand had simply grabbed the branch and twisted until the fibers gave way. Miller gasped, pointing at one branch still hanging, the sap bleeding out. "That's too high for a bear, even standing up, and it's too strong for any elk or deer." It was intentional vandalism, a boundary marker drawn by an unseen power. It was telling us, "You do not go this way." I pulled out my hunting knife, the weight of the steel strangely comforting, though I knew it was useless against whatever force had done this. My mind kept cycling back to the briefing about the missing person we were supposed to find, a seasoned hiker who had seemingly vanished into thin air 3 weeks prior. We had dismissed the initial local reports of a giant walking man as folklore, focused instead on hypothermia or injury. Now I wondered if the missing hiker hadn't disappeared, but had merely been absorbed into this ecosystem managed by shadow. The sun began its slow descent, threatening to plunge us into another night of cold, alert paranoia. We found a small sheltered overhang near a rocky outcrop, the best we could manage for a campsite. As we started to boil water for meager dehydrated rations, Jackson suddenly froze, his eyes wide and fixed on the darkness between 2 ancient cedars 50 yards away. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling so violently the movement shook the tin cup in his hand. We listened. The silence was absolute. "Hear what, Jackson? The wind?" I tried to keep my voice steady, professional, but the lie tasted bitter. There was no wind. No, sir, it was a cough, like clearing a heavy throat, and it sounded wet. We stared into the dark. If the creature was 50 yards away, that meant it had been watching us set up camp. It had been within smelling distance of our cooking fire, watching us unpack our weapons. It had waited until we were at our most vulnerable, stationary and tired before issuing a challenge. A deliberate, human-like sound. It wasn't trying to scare us away with a roar. It was making its presence known with chilling intimacy. I grabbed the thermal optics unit, lifting the heavy eyepiece to my face. The world immediately transformed into shades of green and yellow. I scanned the perimeter, focusing on the dark gaps where the trees merged. The optics revealed the rocks, the warm embers of our tiny fire, the faint residual heat signatures from our bodies. And then I saw it. Or rather, I saw the absence of heat. In the precise spot Jackson had indicated, there was a black void. It was too dense, too large to be a patch of cold moss or an old stump. It was the shape of a massive vertical pillar, absorbing all ambient heat, radiating nothing. It was either perfectly insulated, or it was standing in a way that masked its thermal profile. perhaps hiding behind the immense trunk of a cedar. I held my breath, focusing the lens, trying to catch any flicker of movement. The air seemed to shimmer near the void. And then, slowly, a spot of heat appeared, brief and intense, perhaps 6 feet off the ground, quickly vanishing. It was an eye, a momentary reflection of residual heat as something blinked, before the shield snapped shut again. My hand started shaking so badly that the thermal scope rattled against my helmet. I lowered it slowly, trying to maintain some semblance of control. My heart felt like a drum being pounded inside my ribs. "Did you see anything, Captain?" Miller asked, his rifle already leveled, though aimed vaguely into the general darkness. I couldn't tell them what I saw. Not exactly. To say I saw a massive shadow that somehow defied thermodynamics, a shadow that blinked, would shatter the last vestige of operational discipline. "Negative," I lied, swallowing hard. "Just thermal noise. Stay alert. We double the watch tonight. 2 hours on, 2 off. No exceptions." But the damage was done. The atmosphere around our tiny fire was poisoned. We weren't a search team anymore. We were 4 tired, frightened men huddling in the dark, waiting for the intelligent darkness to make its next move. The exhaustion of day 3 brought us to a breaking point. Later, during my watch, sometime near 0200, I started going over the possibilities in a frantic internal monologue. What if this wasn't protection? What if this was a slow, deliberate cornering? My training screamed for logic. We needed to backtrack. But every attempt to retrace our steps led us into thicker underbrush, into more bewildering, looping ravines. It was as if the path home was physically sealed off. I remembered a conversation I'd had with an old man in the local general store before we deployed. He was a grizzled logger, rumored to have spent 70 years in these woods. He'd looked at our high-tech gear and just shook his head, a look of profound pity in his eyes. "You looking for the lost boy? Ranger?" he'd asked, chewing slowly on tobacco. "Yes, sir. We're optimized for this kind of terrain." He'd spat toward the floor. "The forest gives up what it wants to give up, not what you got equipment for. And if something takes someone, you don't go barging in, you wait for the price." I had dismissed it as the ramblings of a superstitious old drunk. Now, staring into the impenetrable blackness that held a silent, watchful giant, the old man's words echoed with terrifying clarity. We weren't searching for the lost hiker anymore. We were hostages in an ancient game, and whatever was following us was the game master. The creature's behavioral signs intensified as the night wore on. It stopped being merely a shadow and started being an active, psychological presence. At one point, a low, guttural noise emanated from a hilltop behind us. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was a rhythmic sound deep in the chest, almost like a morning call, or perhaps a kind of rhythmic drumbeat. It lasted for 20 seconds, vibrating in the soil beneath my boots, and then stopped abruptly. The air felt heavy, charged with something unnatural. Jackson, asleep near the fire pit, bolted upright, screaming incoherently. I rushed to him, grabbing his shoulders. He was shivering, his eyes darting frantically. "It knows my name, Captain. It knows my name," he choked out, gasping for air. "I heard it in the trees. It wasn't my voice, but it said Jackson." It was the third layer of the reveal. Behavioral signs bordering on mimicry. Was it imitating our voices, or was it merely mimicking the cadence of human speech? Either way, the implication was catastrophic. It was close enough and intelligent enough to observe our interactions and replicate them for maximum psychological damage. It was trying to break us. I looked at the others. Miller and Davis were pale, their weapons held too tightly. We were 3 days into the supposed search, rapidly running out of food, fuel, and sanity. Our radios were useless, the signal mysteriously blocked since the end of day 2. We had convinced ourselves that if we moved constantly, we could escape the influence, but the opposite was true. The creature encouraged our movement, letting us tire ourselves out, pushing us gently, like livestock, along a path of its choosing. We were being led somewhere. The only question that mattered on the morning of day 4 was, where and why? I stood watch until the gray light of dawn broke through the haze. The silent dread had solidified into cold, hard certainty. The Bigfoot wasn't hunting us for food. If it wanted us dead, we would have been crushed in our sleep. It wasn't trying to chase us away. It was ensuring we stayed exactly where it wanted us. As the team slowly packed their gear, moving with the sluggishness of men already defeated, I looked one last time at the direction we had tried to head, west, toward civilization. The line of impossibly broken branches formed a perfect, defiant barricade. Then I looked north. A slight trail, barely visible, seemed to snake through the dense, untouched thicket. It was a path we had ignored repeatedly, judging it too steep, too rugged, and completely inconsistent with our map coordinates. But as I looked at it now, under the morning light, I noticed something strange. The footprints, the massive, heavy impressions were pointed that way. Not away, not lurking, but leading down that forbidden path. It was an invitation or perhaps an order. And for the first time in 3 days, I felt a terrible, heavy urge to follow it, driven by a primal instinct that screamed, "The Watcher is tired of the game. It's time to choose." We packed our last energy bars. The official explanation, the narrative we would later try to construct, would focus on faulty compasses, severe exhaustion, and navigational errors. Hallucination under duress, the sheriff would eventually write in his brief report. Possible bear interaction. But the truth I held onto like a shard of glass in my gut, was that the forest had a keeper, and that keeper had been guiding us for 72 hours. And now the lesson was over. "We follow the northern trajectory," I announced, my voice husky, not even attempting to sound rational. I didn't reference the map. I didn't reference the compass. I simply started walking toward the path the creature had clearly delineated, driven by a fear so complete it had bypassed terror and reached a state of morbid acceptance. We had been lost, and now, perhaps, we were about to be shown. The price for the guidance, however, remained completely unknown. And that uncertainty, that silent negotiation with the ancient intelligence, was the deepest fear of all. We were stepping off the map and into its domain, completely and utterly trusting the wisdom of the thing that had been stalking us. The morning of the 4th day wasn't a morning, it was an insult. A cold, aggressive fog had swallowed the timberline completely, leaching the color and the warmth from everything. It was a suffocating silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums until you want to scream just to break the vacuum. My 3 men, or what was left of them, were huddled beneath a rock overhang, their faces drawn tight with a hunger that had gone beyond physical need and settled into a spiritual malignancy. We hadn't seen the sun since the day before we were supposed to rendezvous, and the ration count was a joke. We were operating on instinct and the corrosive realization that our technical expertise was worthless against this wilderness. I remember staring at the dead GPS screen, the battery having finally given up the ghost hours ago, and feeling nothing but a profound, aching emptiness. That device, which promised to connect us to the world, was just a smooth piece of plastic now, a monument to our failure. It was then, in that moment of absolute surrender to the geography, that the pattern finally ceased to be a terrifying coincidence and solidified into a cold, horrifying truth. For 3 days we had felt the pressure. The weight of observation was a constant physical ache between my shoulder blades. We had attributed the broken branches and the fresh, impossibly large tracks, always 50 or 60 yards off our erratic course, to a persistent, perhaps territorial animal. But animals don't maintain a 3-day parallel surveillance without ever attempting to close the distance or display aggression. Animals hunt. They don't babysit. It hit me with the force of a punch to the diaphragm. We hadn't been lost. We had been herded. I stood up, shaking off the thin film of moisture that coated everything. My joints cracked like dry timber. "We need to move," I whispered, the sound swallowed immediately by the fog. Miller, the youngest and the one suffering the worst from exposure, didn't look up. "Where, Chief?" "We've been circling that damned basalt ridge since yesterday afternoon. We're going in circles. The magnetic north is playing games." He was right. We had been following outdated maps, trying to find a high-elevation stream that should have been there but wasn't. The geography felt alien, rearranged by something larger than human effort. I ignored him, my mind fixed on the footprints. Just hours ago, near the small fetid pool where we filtered our last drops of water, I had seen a set. They weren't the dusty, week-old tracks we had started finding near the search area. These were distinct, fresh, the ground still slightly depressed around the edges. But what froze the blood in my veins wasn't the size, it was the direction. The creature's prints weren't pointing parallel to us anymore. They were pointing away, directly toward the darkest, most impassable section of the woods, where the ravines dropped sharply and the old growth choked out the light. It wasn't hiding the path anymore. It was indicating it. The realization brought a rush of both extreme terror and perverse relief. If the thing was capable of following us so meticulously, so silently, then it was intelligent. And if it was intelligent, it had a purpose beyond simple predation. The horrifying part was admitting that our survival now depended entirely on trusting the intentions of the very thing that had driven us to the brink of madness. I walked over to the others, speaking in a low, strained voice. Listen to me. Forget the compass. Forget the maps. We are changing course. We are going to follow the prints. Silence. Even the sound of their chattering teeth seemed to stop. Harris, the most pragmatic of the group, slowly looked up, his eyes bloodshot and accusatory. You're serious? You want us to follow that thing? The thing that's been messing with us for 72 hours. We follow the bear sign? It's not a bear, Harris, I said, the words heavy and definitive. If it were a bear, we'd be dead. Bears are messy. They warn you. They crash through the brush. This thing is spectral. It's been orbiting us just outside the visual spectrum, maintaining a perimeter. It knows we're here, it knows where we are trying to go, and it knows we failed. I crouched down, drawing a rough diagram in the damp earth. Think about the behavior. Day 1, we were energetic, loud, focused on the search. The prints were random, far apart, like it was observing. Day 2, we started getting lost, confused. The tracks tightened, showing up closer to our camp, subtly shifting our trajectory away from the cliff faces maybe. Day 3, we were exhausted, argumentative. And now, this morning, the prints are ahead of us, clear, undeniable. They lead in one single direction, straight through the mess. And what if that direction is its den, or a feeding ground? Miller choked out, pulling his ragged woolen blanket tighter around his shoulders. The fear was palpable, a heavy metallic taste in the air. But I found a strange, cold clarity. Then we die quickly, and not slowly by starvation or exposure. But I don't think that's the intention. If it wanted to kill us, it would have done so in the night, silently. It had 3 nights, gentlemen. 3 nights of us asleep, defenseless. No, this is different. This is calculated. I stood up, hefting my empty pack. We move now, and we move silently, following the direction of the tracks. We will watch for any sign of ambush, but we have no other choice. Every path we have chosen has led us deeper into the labyrinth. Maybe the labyrinth's master knows the way out. The ascent was grim, unspoken. They rose slowly, bodies aching from the cold sleep and the gnawing anxiety. The fear was transforming into a desperate, focused energy. We were no longer 4 independent search members. We were a single, terrified organism, hitching its fate to the shadow that haunted our periphery. We began walking, my eyes glued to the earth, looking for the telltale compression of the massive foot. The fog was relentless, reducing visibility to maybe 15 feet, forcing us to stay shoulder to shoulder. The air quality changed quickly. We left behind the damp, musty smell of rotting leaves and stagnant water and entered a pocket of air that felt strangely dry, almost antiseptic, though it still held that faint, sweet musk I had smelled days ago, like old wood smoke and wet dog, but overlaid with something else, something intensely alive like ozone. It took maybe an hour of tense, silent movement before the next, undeniable intervention occurred. We stopped at a stretch where the undergrowth was so dense, a barricade of thorny vines and tangled rhododendron, that we would have spent an hour hacking through it with our useless knives. But here, a passage had been cleared. It wasn't a human clearing. The opening was tall, unnaturally so, maybe 9 feet high and wide enough for a massive body to pass through unhindered. The branches hadn't been cut. They had been violently snapped, cleanly and efficiently, often at a height far above my head. The raw, splintered wood of the breaks was still pale, fresh. We stood at the entrance to this unnatural corridor, our breaths held tight. "It just happened," Harris whispered, his voice trembling. "It just happened." It was clearing the path ahead of us. The sheer speed required to do that, to move unseen, to clear a passage that efficient while maintaining distance, was paralyzing. It proved that the creature was not only following us, but moving several orders of magnitude faster than we were, operating in a reality where the limitations of terrain did not apply. I stepped into the gap first. The sense of walking into a trap was overwhelming, but the alternative was stagnation and hypothermia. As we moved through the corridor, which was remarkably straight, almost engineered, I started noticing details that suggested not just great strength but meticulous planning. At one point, a thick fallen cedar log lay across the path, a perfect tripping hazard in the low visibility. It hadn't been moved by brute force alone. It had been rolled aside, angled perfectly to buttress against a large boulder, preventing it from rolling back into the newly cleared way. This was logistics. This was intelligence at work. "It knows we're struggling," Miller whispered, his eyes wide, tracking the broken branches high above. "It's taking pity on us." Pity. The word was absurd, terrifying. Were we being led out of the woods, or simply being moved to a location where the entity could study us under better conditions? Was this the prelude to the final, horrifying confrontation? My trauma wasn't just the fear of death. It was the realization that everything I believed about the natural world was a comfortable lie. We were not the apex predator here. We were children lost in the domain of something primordial, something that understood the terrain in a way we never could. The path continued for what felt like miles, occasionally dipping down a steep incline. At each potentially hazardous spot, a slick rock face, a sudden muddy drop, the entity had left a marker. Not a sign we could read, but a physical alteration. Once it was a perfectly placed, large flat stone that acted as a step. Another time, it was a hanging vine that had been pulled down and wrapped around a thick tree trunk, creating a temporary sturdy rope handhold. It was constructing a trail for us. We were following a search party of one, and that one was the legendary monster we were always taught to fear. The silence around us intensified. The local birds, the small ground animals, they had all vanished. The forest seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't the natural silence of high altitude. This was a commanded silence, a heavy, oppressive quiet enforced by the presence of something overwhelmingly dominant. Then came the sound. It didn't come from the front or the side, but seemed to resonate from the very earth beneath our boots. It was a low, resonant thrum, far below the range of human speech, a deep infrasound that vibrated in our sternums, making our teeth ache. It was not a growl, nor a warning. It was directional. The sound pulsed 3 times, a slow, deliberate cadence. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It felt like the vibration of an ancient, massive bell being struck deep underground. And then, just as suddenly, it ceased. I looked at Harris and Miller. They were paralyzed, their faces pale gray in the misty light. "Did you feel that?" I managed to rasp. Harris just nodded, unable to speak. In my chest, like my heart stopped for a second. I realized then that the sound hadn't been a threat. It had been a sonar ping, a locational beacon. It was communicating its position to us, not through language, but through pure physics. And the position it was broadcasting was directly ahead, just beyond the thicket we were approaching. I raised my rifle, checking the chamber uselessly. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped the weapon. The moment of confrontation was upon us. We had accepted the guidance, and now the guide was waiting. We moved forward, step by agonizing step, drawn by the residual warmth of that incredible resonant vibration. The air grew even drier, sharper. And then, through a parting in the dense branches that the creature had cleared, I saw it. Not the full, overwhelming silhouette, not yet, but a monumental, dark shape standing at the edge of a deep, sheer drop. It wasn't moving. It was just waiting, a pillar of muscle and dense, dark fur against the indifferent gray of the dawn. It was the definition of stillness, an artifact carved from the primordial forest itself. And as the fog shifted, caught by a tiny, sudden draft, I saw the angle of its head. It was looking not at the abyss, but back down the cleared path, directly at the four pathetic figures who had dared to trespass in its domain. It had led us this far. Now, we had to see what came next. The terrifying part was realizing that the deepest layer of the fog wasn't surrounding us. It was covering the massive cliff face beyond the creature, hiding the truth of where we were being led. The sound had stopped, replaced only by the frantic drumming of my own heart, a pitiful, weak counterpoint to the resonant silence left by the ancient guide. We were at the precipice, and the only one who knew the way forward was the one we had spent our lives denying. It's been 40 years since the cold of that night left my bones, but the shadows it cast are still long enough to cover this entire room. We were saved, yes, in the most impossible, humiliating way imaginable. But survival, I learned that night, is sometimes a far heavier burden than simply dying lost and alone. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. The fear, up until that final hour, had been a cold, dull weight. The certainty of our end. We had stopped caring about the missing hiker. We cared only about the next breath, the next failed attempt to light a fire with wet moss, the next bitter argument over whether the sun rose to the left or the right. We were three professionals reduced to whimpering, shivering animals, squatting beneath the oppressive canopy of old-growth cedar. The world had shrunk to the space between our chattering teeth. Chad, bless his heart, was hallucinating, talking about his wife's apple pie. Mike was silent, his eyes wide and vacant, staring past the trees and into the black void. I was watching the fog, watching how it coiled and shifted, realizing that the forest wasn't just silent. It was holding its breath. It was during the deepest, coldest pocket of that final night, maybe an hour before the first hint of gray dawn, that the silence broke, not with a sound of nature, but with a sound of profound presence. It wasn't a footstep. It was the subtle, deep thump of tons of ancient muscle settling into stillness just 20 feet away. We were frozen. We hadn't dared to look up for maybe 10 minutes. We simply knew. The 3 days of tracking, the feeling of being observed, the missing gear found placed neatly on stones. It all coalesced into a single terrifying truth. We were being curated. We hadn't been lost for 3 days, we had been managed. I lifted my head slowly, the wet wool of my jacket scraping against my ear. The fog was thick, like milk poured through the trees, but the presence cut through it. He was waiting. He was massive, standing far taller than I could have imagined, yet moving with the precision and grace of a feather settling on glass. His fur, the color of wet obsidian and ancient bark, seemed to absorb the minimal light, making him a negative space against the gray world. The most striking thing was the posture, not the hunched gait of a primate, but the upright, shoulders-back stance of an old warrior, a sentinel that had stood guard since before our species learned to walk erect. The smell, it was powerful now, overwhelming the damp earth and pine. It was musk, yes, but mixed with something metallic and green like fresh blood on crushed juniper. It was the scent of antiquity and raw power. He wasn't growling. He wasn't threatening. He was simply watching us with eyes that were too large, too dark, and horrifyingly intelligent. They didn't reflect confusion or aggression. They reflected weary patience. They were eyes that had seen forests burn and rivers shift course. They were the eyes of the custodian of this forgotten land. In that moment, the terror dissolved, replaced by a crystalline clarity that shook me to the core. This creature hadn't been stalking us to kill us. It had been stalking us to hurt us. We were 3 clumsy insects wandering into a complex web, and it had simply been pushing us toward the exit. It knew exactly where we were going, and it knew we were incapable of finding it ourselves. I whispered, the sound catching in my throat. "It's not moving." Chad made a choked sound. "It's waiting." Then, the creature moved. Not towards us, but parallel to us. It took one deliberate step onto a small, elevated mound, a patch of rock and tangled roots we had argued fiercely about ignoring an hour earlier, convinced it led to an impassable ravine. The Bigfoot paused, looked back at us, and then turned its massive head slightly, indicating the direction it had just taken. It was a clear, unmistakable invitation. It wasn't using words, but the communication was the loudest sound I had ever heard. "This is the path. Follow me, or stay here and die." The choice was absurd but immediate. We were already dead, wandering the purgatory of that forest. Following the primordial monster that had haunted our dreams felt strangely less terrifying than accepting defeat to the cold. I pushed myself up, my knees cracking audibly, and nudged Mike. "We go, we follow it." Mike only nodded, his face still pale white. Chad surprisingly stood up without question, his eyes fixed on the retreating black shape. We began the slowest, most agonizing march of our lives. The Bigfoot walked at a measured pace, slow enough that our starved, hypothermic bodies could keep up, but fast enough to convey urgency. It never looked back, but we knew it was aware of our every stuttered step. It didn't use the main game trails. It moved through a thicket, forcing us to crawl under low branches, and then stepped over a massive fallen log that we barely managed to clamber onto. The direction it chose was counterintuitive, moving steeply downhill into what should have been dense, impenetrable brush. But as we followed, a miraculous thing happened. The brush wasn't impenetrable. The creature was leading us along a path that wasn't marked on any map, a ghost trail known only to the truly ancient things of this forest. It was faint, perhaps used only by the creature itself, winding perfectly around the deepest mud pits and the steepest rock faces. It was a secret language written in the arrangement of the trees. For perhaps an hour we walked in awestruck silence, the massive black figure 20 yards ahead, gliding through the gloom. It wasn't walking on the trail, it was the trail. Then, the ground changed. The thick, mossy earth gave way to harder, compacted soil. And then, we smelled it. Wood smoke. Faint, distant, but undeniably human. The Bigfoot stopped abruptly. We stopped too, panting, leaning on each other for support. We had reached a small, high plateau overlooking a narrow river valley. Through the remaining fog, I could see the unmistakable geometric lines of an old logging road. Civilization. Our jeep. The creature didn't turn around. It remained facing the valley, its head slightly bowed. We were safe. The transaction was complete. But as the first tentative shafts of weak sunlight broke through the canopy, illuminating the valley, I looked down at the creature's immense feet. That's when I saw it. Resting neatly at the base of the tree where the Bigfoot stood was the missing hiker's backpack. It was pristine, unopened, and clearly placed there. Next to it, meticulously laid out on a smooth stone, was the hiker's compass and a cheap plastic-framed picture of his family. The hiker wasn't lost. He was gone. And the Bigfoot hadn't just saved us. It had collected the remnants. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath. This being had known the truth the entire time. It had allowed us to waste 3 days searching for the living, knowing we were looking for the dead, only intervening when our own survival became critical. It had shown us the way home, but it had also shown us the final resting place of the one we failed. I took one step forward, intending to shout, to ask, why? Before the sound could leave my mouth, the creature moved. It simply melted into the thicket behind it, not running, but flowing. In a blink, where a 10-foot giant had stood, there was only the cold, still forest. Mike stumbled toward the backpack. Chad just knelt, sobbing uncontrollably into the mud. We walked out of those woods 30 minutes later, alive, but fundamentally broken. The official explanation was simple and concise: temporary disorientation caused by extreme exposure and mild hypothermia. We had inadvertently stumbled onto an old unmarked trapper's route, which led directly to the river access point. The hiker's backpack was found nearby, confirming that he had likely met with a fatal fall into the gorge further upriver, his body already swept away. Missing persons closed the file. Nobody mentioned the 3 days of feeling watched. Nobody mentioned the creature. Chad was the first to enforce the silence. When the sheriff asked how they survived the final night, Chad simply repeated the official line, robotic and distant. Mike, when questioned, just stared at the wall until they stopped pressing him. For me, the trauma manifested as an absolute incompatibility with my old life. How could I continue to be a forest ranger, supposedly an expert in those woods, when I knew that the true master of that domain was an ancient, intelligent being and that I owed it my life? I resigned a week later. I cited exhaustion and stress. They didn't argue. But the consequences didn't end with my career. 2 weeks after we returned, 2 men in tailored suits, not police, not military, but something corporate and sterile, visited me. They knew details. They knew exactly where we camped on the second night. They asked pointedly, "Did you or your colleagues experience any unusual sensory input, any localized acoustic anomalies, or visual disturbances of large bipedal forms?" I lied. I looked them straight in their cold eyes and said, "We were freezing and starving. We saw shadows. Nothing more." They left, but the message was clear. Silence was not just recommended, it was mandatory. The truth, they needed me to understand, belonged only to the darkness of that canyon. The trauma didn't fade. It corroded me slowly, year after year. I carried the guilt like lead in my stomach. The creature saved us, but it had allowed us to walk past the dying man for 3 days. Was that mercy, or was it a lesson in our own triviality? The thought haunted me. Perhaps the creature wasn't saving us because we were valuable. Perhaps it saved us because we were its responsibility. And allowing us to perish on its watch would have been a disorder it couldn't tolerate. We were livestock returned to the pen. I tried to tell my wife once, years later, late one night. I started talking about the eyes, the immense antiquity in them. She listened for 5 minutes, then gently suggested I needed therapy. Our marriage didn't last. The secret was too heavy for 2 people to bear. I moved away from the mountains. I tried to forget the sharp, cold scent of the cedar and the musk. But every time I saw dense forest on the horizon, I felt that pull, that terrifying, respectful awe. Now, decades later, my hands shake when I hold this glass of water. My voice trembles. I am an old man, and the witnesses, Chad and Mike, are both gone now, taking their silence with them. I realize now that the creature didn't just show us the way home. It showed us the truth about the wilderness. We are guests, flimsy and fleeting, relying on the immense patience of beings we cannot comprehend. It held the map of our rescue in its massive hand, and it decided on its own terms when our ordeal would end. I was shown a glimpse of the real world that night, a world where evolution took a different, darker, smarter turn, a world where the ancient guardians still walk, silent and imposing. Some things in those woods were never meant for us. We were only given temporary passage. But they're still out there, managing the paths, waiting. And sometimes, they choose who gets to live, and who gets to stay forever. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. Stay safe out there, and remember that sometimes the longest way around is the quickest way home. Unless you have a guide,